Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about atypical sexual behaviors. To begin this lecture, we're going to look at what constitutes atypical sexual behaviors. Again, to approach this, we have to remember that wherever we're going to diagnose any kind of mental disorder, we have to consider it in a cultural context, meaning that we have to consider how we socially construct social norms, and then we dictate what kind of behavior deviates from that type of social norm, okay? So again, albeit it's in humans to be violent, when you have someone who, exhibits that type of violence and goes around hurting people, at what point do we label that as beyond just the normal type of behavior, for example? Do we expect people to control their violence? At what point do we label them a sociopath? So again, you can look at things like sexuality. Historically, we used to label non-heterosexual sexual behavior as deviant, and then we would institutionalize or criminalize that type of behavior. And that went on for centuries. So again, we always have to think about it in a cultural context. Humans are capable of an incredible amount of types of behaviors, and some that we would in modern times label bad, and some that we could label good or we could label normal. But think about it, do humans have it in us to kill? Do they abuse children? Do they hurt their spouses? Do they just have random fights in bars? Do they go to war? Do they commit genocide? Okay. So again, when you think about the human experience, you have to open it up into broad terms. If it was 1,000 years ago and I was a Viking, I would put a sword in my son's hand and tell him to go over to England and rape and pillage. Is that accurate? I mean, think about the cultural context, for example. So when the same thing comes to sexuality, at what point do we label something as deviant and then diagnose it as a disorder? And of course, we can separate out deviance from disorders. Disorders can be based in physiological processes, and deviance is, usually situated in a socially constructed cultural norm. But again, they tend to cross over. Cultural norms, social norms that regulate our behavior, including formal norms like laws, okay? These exist to regulate human behavior. There's a reason we've come up with these rules, these regulations, okay? So whenever I'm questioning what is considered abnormal when it comes to sexuality, again, I always have to consider the cultural context. I mean, think about the kings of England. Back in the day, they would marry off 12-year-olds like it was nothing. Thomas Jefferson had sex with a 14-year-old slave. Could that slave consent? Is that child too young? Generally, girls back then wouldn't even get to their periods till they were 16. The reason girls get to their periods earlier in modern times, of course, is because of, trends in nutrition and things along those lines. But back then, 16 was about, the proper age of, when they were no longer prepubescent children. You know what I mean? So again, is Thomas Jefferson a rapist and a pedophile, or is that the norm for the times? But even then, it wasn't. Even then, that was taboo, and Thomas Jefferson caught flack for it. So, but again, we need to ask questions: what's acceptable and what's not? Is it okay to have sex with multiple partners? Does that deviate from social norms? Do we label that a diagnosis? Is it okay to have sex with someone of a different sex than you? Does that cause any harm? Who actually gets hurt? The people that are being stigmatized. Again, who is there individual or social harm from two people of the same sex hooking up? How does that actually hurt anybody? Maybe their ideologies or something, their belief systems, but again, there's so many counter belief to systems and societies across the world that there's always someone who's going to disagree with the way you're living your life. You know what I mean? So, at what point do we label something as atypical and put this stern diagnoses, these stern labels to say that it doesn't constitute something that is acceptable? Okay. And so I every time I go to have these lectures, I just have to bring up the cultural context because it's us that labels what's deviant. And then depending upon the time frame, the country we're in, it changes. It's constantly in flux. Norms, attitudes about what's cool and what's not is constantly in flux. But again, in order for something to be labeled a diagnosis, I like to approach it as, does it cause individual harm to other individuals and to that person? And then how does it affect society in general? And so again, when we look at it through like a functionalist theory, what's the purpose of social institutions to regulate our behavior, including sexual behavior like rape? Why are there laws, to protect people and to enforce not raping people? Okay, because this causes not only individual harm, but also social harm. So we have created these rules, and then we have established institutions to enforce these rules for some sort of social protection, to have stability in the world, to protect the citizens, whatever the purpose of that institution might be. But again, so when we think about why we come up with these rules, this is a really good way to frame it. And again, we always refer to the DSM-5, which I'll bring it up in a second, but when we're going to label something as a diagnosis, we have to just question the cultural context always, okay? And so the DSM-4 basically says this has to happen for something to be considered an atypical sexual behavior. The individual who is experiencing it or engaging this type of behavior has to feel distress about their interest. And then they could have a sexual desire that causes distress, injury, or death in others and lack of legal consent. And so that's what your book breaks out for that. So again, what characterizes the most 8 common paraphilic disorders? And for me, I find it easy sometimes just to chart stuff out. So I busted out this chart. This is a little bit later, a little bit more in depth than your book's going to get into, but it just helps me keep things in clarity. And I kind of broke it up into the types of atypical sexual behaviors. How often does this happen? How do we treat it? And then any other interesting information that I might have learned on that topic. But the first couple we're going to look at are exhibitionism, which involves exposing genitals to unsuspecting people for sexual gratification. Key here is unsuspecting people, okay? Humans are into bodies and body parts, and you can't deny that. But again, as long as consenting, and it's 2 people just consenting, then it doesn't really cross this line into what we would call atypical behavior. But when it becomes to unconsenting, people, and also manifesting these fantasies, urges, and behaviors to do it, that's the point at which we're like, okay, this is no longer socially acceptable. We need to diagnose this, okay? How often does this happen? About 2 to 4% of the population. Men are more likely than women to experience this. How can we treat it? Through therapy, support groups, anti-androgen medicine, again, to reduce the testosterone, for example. Okay. Yeah. This class was hard for me to take. The hardest class I ever took for my PhD was this class. Because you're opening up the dark, what could be labeled as dark and hard to cope with aspects of human behavior. But again, why are we looking at this in a psychology class? Because again, it affects a percentage of the population. People are struggling with this as perpetrators and from the victim standpoint. It's a psychological thing because it involves cognitions, biological functions influencing the way you think, and then how the social context influences your perception of what's acceptable behavior and how you should engage in behavior. Again, we're in that middle ground here. There's voyeurism, experiencing sexual arousal from, again, observing unsuspecting people naked, undressing, or engaging in sexual activity. About 7% of the population, men again more likely on this one. How to treat it, individual and group therapy, support groups, medicines like antidepressants, anti-anxiety, and anti-androgen are included. This category can also be broken into many paraphilic acts, including pictophilia, pornography, scopophilia, watching people undress, and scoptophilia, watching people engage in sexual activity. This generally involves predatory objectification of people without their consent. Okay. Pedophilia, again, opening Pandora's box of depression and sadness. children are victims in so many ways, from sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect. This is a group of people that have brains that haven't evolved to the extent that legally they don't have the right to consent. Okay. Very sad subject. It's a sexual orientation involving a sexual interest in, again, prepubescent children. And again, the law is different in each state. Sometimes it ranges 17, 18, 19, but that's about the age of consent depending upon the state. About 5% of the population experience this, 3 to 9% exhibit it. But again, here you have to ask, how is this in our DNA? How is it possible humans are able to engage in such acts? And again, I'm just going to leave that as an unsettling thought. But again, it opens you up. How do you commit genocide? How do the Nazis dehumanize Jewish, homosexual, disabled people, gypsies? Okay. How does the governor of California pay $15 for the scalp of a Native American? How does a Native American scalp someone who's white? Again, just questions back and forth. The dark side of this, it's unlikely that the sexual orientation can be changed. And I don't like this phrase sexual orientation, but again, this is straight out of the literature. Therefore, the goal of treatment for pedophilia is to reduce sexual arousal for prepubescents by managing and controlling urges while not engaging in sexual acts with prepubescents. Applied behavioral techniques, including teaching suppression and aversion techniques through therapy. Cognitive techniques include addressing attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors involved with sexual arousal for prepubescents, along with using anti-androgen medicine and castration. Yeah. Sexual masochism, receiving pleasure from receiving humiliation, binding, and pain. Again, being like tied up, for example. 1 to 5% of the population exhibit this. Males are more likely than females to express masochistic tendencies. Suggested therapy and mitigation for treatment. Cognitive therapy often involves discovering the source of the behavior. But again, sexual masochism in itself is at what point does this cause distress? Because this could just be what you could call just a general kink or something along those lines. But if it causes distress, but again, sexual masochism, receiving sexual pleasure from humiliation and binding and pain, as long as it's consensual, you know what I mean? So that's where we got to always look at. Is it causing individual and social harm? Is it consensual? Okay. All right. And then sexual sadism is the opposite. This is receiving pleasure from inflicting humiliation, binding, and pain. And again, at what point is this consensual? And at what point does this border on abuse? Because again, if you're using some kind of physical, you know what I mean? So again, we have to clearly label. And again, at what point does this cause distress? You see about 2% of the population exhibiting this, males more than females. Diagnosis requires recurring fantasies, urges, and behaviors for at least 6 months that cause distress, impairment, personal harm, or harm to others. Okay, transvestic fetishism. And again, these next two are not so much social harm problems. It's at what point does it cause individual harm or distress? So transvestic fetishism is cross-dressing by wearing clothes of the opposite sex. Doesn't really harm anybody. Maybe offends someone's attitudes in, an intolerant kind of socially stigmatic environment. But again, but this might cause the individual distress if it's causing problems or causing them conflicts in their lives, or they're experiencing some kind of internal psychological distress. 3% of men and 0.4% of women experience this. Therapy, again, is recommended to manage these self-perceptions and cope with distress that might be internal or external, and medication can be used for things like anxiety, depression. The disparity between men and women, almost 4 to 1 regarding the experience of this behavior, is interesting. And again, why? Because we can look at things like cultural norms. Can girls cross over into male clothes a little bit easier than males crossing over into girl clothes, for example? Fetishism, receiving sexual pleasure from inanimate objects and non-genital body parts. It is unclear how much of people have this disorder. Men are more likely than women to experience this. Again, through therapy, temporal lobotomy, which is dark, medication, hypnosis, or suggested treatments. This can be explained from multiple perspectives, including biological temporal lobe dysfunctions, like physical, cognitive, physical, neuroscience kind of structural problems. Neuroscience structural problems. I'm sorry, that's a silly way. Neural structural problems, physical problems in the brain. Okay. Um, Cognitive thought process dysfunctions and sociocultural learning, for example. This often involves the senses such as touch, taste, smell, and visual that support sexual excitement. Then we have Fraudurism, again, touching or rubbing a non-consenting person. Again, here we label on the socially deviant, unacceptable behavior, okay, because this causes individual and social harm. Fraudurism is most likely exhibited by men. Rarely do women engage in this. It's estimated 7 to 9% of men engage in this. Therapy and medication are suggested for treatment along with cognitive and behavioral techniques like aversion therapy. When investigated, many individuals diagnosed with this disorder reported engaging in hundreds of acts of fraudurism. Okay. Yeah. Gerontophilia. And again, the elderly, another very vulnerable population. Again, when we look at things like rape, women 18 to 24, highest amount, but we often don't think about the elderly and children. We do think about it, but again, this is a huge, big problem, big vulnerable groups. Like these are very vulnerable groups. Gerontophilia is a sexual preference for the elderly. This is unknown. And again, but at what point does this cause distress, pain, things along that line? We have to ask because there's movies like Harold and Maude where you have this young guy in his 20s getting with an elderly lady, and it was a historical classic movie kind of thing, Gerontophilia is not included as a disorder for these kinds of reasons. But again, is it atypical sexual behavior? And at what point does it cause harm and distress? And when does it cross the line? Treatment is not sought unless it causes distress, impairment, or harm to oneself or others. Therapy and medication suggested for treatment. The body type of the elderly attracts individuals. However, the act of the young and old engaging in sexual activity has social taboos attached to these actions. Again, what is acceptable partner ranges is socially dictated. A lot of it's influenced by biology. There's evolutionary psychology that looks at, physical attraction to certain age groups compared to men versus women, and a lot of studies on that. You can check that out. But again, harm may come to the elderly when gerontophilia becomes blended with sadism, for example. And then finally, we have zoophilia, sexual preference for animals. Again, there's reasons that we have to have laws against this because humans will engage in behaviors with animals and children and, rape, sexual abuse, a lot of things humans are capable of. 4.9% of men and 1.9% of women experience this. Therapy and medication suggested for treatment. Okay. So again, that was a hard class for me to take, delving deep into each one of these things and looking into it. And this lecture, it gets into that too. This is kind of be hard. But again, what factors contribute to these paraphilic disorders? Again, it's biopsychosocial across the class. You have hormones and neurotransmitters that are motivating you to engage in behavior. It drives you to go out and engage in sexual behavior. And how much conscious control do you have over that? And so again, who is really driving the car? When you study the dual track mind, the conscious and unconscious processes, it's ridiculously complex. We are driven to engage in sexual activity and hang out with people and go out and find food and water. And again, a lot of this is built into our biology, but again, how much do our cognitions control our behavior, learning, observing, growing, perception, emotions, reflecting upon your emotions, coping with your feelings and what your body is telling you, perceiving the social world and what you think is acceptable types of behavior, what you've learned from interacting in the social world as to what's acceptable behavior. And then again, everything we talked in the beginning, the social context and how that structures our sexual behavior. Again, like what is acceptable and what's not. Historically, did men have legal rights to rape their wife, for example? That was written into the United States codes, that men once married had this right. Who wrote the laws? So again, patriarchy and how that contributes to it. All right, it's very complex. The other dark side of this chapter is sexual coercion. Again, just forcing of sex, manipulating, whatever it might be. Again, I had just put up here the dark side of humanity because this is troublesome. I have done so many lectures on this. I have lectures on my YouTube from social problems of, domestic violence, domestic rape, just general sexual and, physical abuse. It's really, really sad. But again, sexual assault and rape happens. It's estimated that 1 out of 3 women and 1 out of 9 men experience this at some point in their lifetime. And again, you have your most likely groups, like women are more likely than men. Women age 18 to 24, that age right there for various reasons. When you're at college, you're out in the world, or whatever it might be. I'll leave you guys to that, but that's just dark, it's sad. But again, why do we have to talk about it? Because it happens. Well, why do humans engage in this behavior is another dark side. I once heard a lecture from the professor from Yale that I had you guys do an assignment on. He was talking about it in terms of evolutionary psychology, in that there's 2 ways to make babies. One is consent and one is through rape. Again, why do humans even have the potential in our DNA to engage in that type of behavior? You know what I mean? How far back does that go? Does that go all the way back to the animal of who we are, humans as animals? But then at some point, we acquired our conscious mind, right? This outer part of our brain, this ability to reflect and consider things like morality. And then we also have developed cultures to structure our sexual behavior. And we've been socialized by agents of socialization like parents, peers, education system, the law, as to what's cool and what's not. Yet this still continues to happen. And again, that's why do we need regulation on sexual behavior? Because without regulation, how do you protect the children and the elderly and the people experiencing sexual assault and rape? And then the other dark side is, are we actually protecting these people? How many sexual assault and rape cases actually go to trial and end up in a conviction? It's something ridiculous like 5%. I mean, like, do they even test the rape kits half the time? Check out some news stories of Detroit not testing their rape kits. I mean, it's utterly depressing and sad. But again, if you're going to study psychology, you have to look at humans for what they are and what they could be and the other nice stuff they do too. Sometimes we're so sweet and nice, yet 1/3 out of women experience sexual assault and rape. 1 out of 5 children experience this kind of stuff. It is utterly depressing. Okay. So again, biology. Yes, it's in us to use violence to get sex. Okay, whether that's for reproductive purposes, whatever, humans have the ability to do it. But again, it's your cognitions that regulate that behavior. Even if your body is like a little more aggressive than it should be, can you think your way out of that and be like, no, this is not cool? And then you have this social context. Like, I have a son, I've since he was like born, I've been like, you will ask consent every time you just want to kiss someone. You know what I mean? Because hopefully we're at that point in society where maybe that's important. It doesn't have to be awkward. You just have fun with it, like, and make it fun and cute or whatever. But it's like the day if you watch Indiana Jones, Harrison Ford just throws the women against the wall and they say no several times, and then eventually they always seem to give in. But that's not cool anymore. Like, you can't do that. Like that typical male Marlon Brando, streetcar named Desire, violent brute who ends up raping the sister in the end too. I mean, like, that is not, but at the same time, that is the reality. It still goes on. Okay. So the psychology of it all is how much is the body influencing these behaviors we're engaging in? Your emotions, your cognitions, your motivations, all that psychological processes. And then you have this social context that's regulating your behavior. And then sexual harassment, as our culture has changed, if you watch Mad Men and how they portray women in the workforce in the 60s, that kind of behavior is no longer acceptable in modern times. And as a result, we've constructed all these institutional laws to structure human behavior and interaction outside of just sexual assault and rape. When it comes to the words that you use, how you talk to people in the work environment, things along those lines. A lot of this is but again, how much does prejudice and discrimination and sexual harassment feed into the blocking of women rising up the social class ladder and having freedom from violence, for example? And then your book also talks about men experiencing sexual harassment, far less than women, but again, same thing, it still occurs. So again, sexual harassment is based upon these stigmas and then these cultural attitudes of what's acceptable and what's not. And so in modern times, we've changed our attitudes and we've changed what we've labeled as what's acceptable and what's not. And in modern times, it's pretty much to the point where, like, can you even compliment someone's looks in modern times? Like, I am uncomfortable with that in a workplace. I wouldn't compliment someone's looks, you know? I try not to notice someone's race or that sounds silly, but again, it's like, how do you remove all bias? How do you not notice someone's race? How do you not notice that they have a birthmark on their face? How do you not notice someone having a disability? How do you not notice, whether someone is female or male? Okay. And so every time you categorize people, each of those categories have attributes and stereotypes attached to them. And some of those stereotypes can be negative. And then we're socialized, we internalize the negative stereotypes, and then that influences our beliefs about other people and how we treat them. And so the second someone realizes that's a woman versus a man, do they treat them differently? I don't know why that thumb up always happens when my fingers are up. I have to learn to not do that because I am not thumbing up that, except for yes, that's a good preacher moment or something along those lines. But again, what's the reality of the world today? Are men and women treated equally? Is there, an intersex? Is there equity across the board? Do we still discriminate based and have prejudice based upon people's looks or whatever it might be? Okay, and do females and males still experience sexual harassment in a variety of institutions, whether it's the workplace, whether it's religion, government, politics, law, working as a police officer, trying to become a construction worker, whatever it might be, okay? And then again, the sexual abuse of children, the dark sides of humanity. Children cannot consent. It is an automatic act of violence, assault, and rape. We have laws established because children are a vulnerable group that need protected. So again, we have clear-cut rules as to what ages are acceptable to engage in sexual relations for the purpose of having a functioning, safe social context, okay? But again, why does all this happen? Biopsychosocial. Humans are capable of anything. How much does society regulate our behavior? How much freedom should we have is a good question. You know what I mean? Things to think about. Okay. Again, this is tough subject. Always is, always gets me.